The summer sun beat mercilessly on the dusty roads of Promise Creek, where Violet James clutched her locket and stared at the horizon, wondering if she had made the greatest mistake of her 19 years by traveling west with nothing but $3 to her name and a heart full of desperate hope. Her entire life was packed into two worn leather cases beside her, each containing carefully folded dresses, letters from her late mother, and a small book of poetry that had sustained her through the 3-day journey by stagecoach. Now abandoned at the edge of town after a dispute with the driver, she felt the weight of her decision pressing down upon her shoulders as heavily as the scorching afternoon heat. The town of Promise Creek, Wyoming Territory, stretched before her like a painting weathered buildings lining a single dirt street, horses tied to hitching posts, and people moving with purpose that made her feel all the more alone. The year 1876 had promised new beginnings across the frontier, but Violet hadn't expected hers to begin quite so unceremoniously. She had left Philadelphia with dreams of teaching in a frontier school, following an advertisement that had promised room, board, and a modest salary. The letter of acceptance had been signed by the town mayor himself, a fact that had given her father enough confidence to allow her this adventure despite his misgivings about a young woman traveling alone. What the advertisement hadn't mentioned was that Promise Creek was still 5 miles beyond where the stagecoach had left her. As the afternoon waned, Violet sat primly on one of her cases, her navy blue traveling dress collecting dust along its hem. She had asked passers-by for directions or assistance, but most had hurried past with nothing more than a curious glance. One older woman had informed her that no transportation would be heading toward Promise Creek until morning. "Please," she had tried again with a bearded man leading a mule. "I need to reach Promise Creek before nightfall." "Ain't nobody going that way today, miss," he'd replied, tipping his hat before continuing on. Hours passed, and as the sun began to sink behind distant mountains, Violet's earlier determination gave way to creeping fear. The station where she had been left was little more than a wooden platform with a small overhang, offering meager protection from the elements. The thought of spending the night alone in such an exposed location made her heart race. She rummaged through her bag and found a slightly crushed biscuit wrapped in waxed paper from her journey. It wasn't much, but it would have to suffice. As she ate, she watched the day's final stagecoach depart in the opposite direction of her destination, carrying with it her last hope of transportation. Darkness fell quickly in the Wyoming Territory, and with it came a chill that penetrated her woolen traveling coat. Violet huddled against her luggage, using one case as a makeshift seat and the other as a barrier against the wind. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, wishing she had thought to pack a heavier blanket accessible from the outside of her luggage. The distant howl of a coyote made her flinch. Her father had warned her about the dangers of the frontier wild animals, harsh weather, and men with even less civility than the beasts. She tried to recall the self-defense techniques her older brother had taught her before she left, but they seemed woefully inadequate against the vastness of the Wyoming night. Sleep came in fits and starts, her body jerking awake at every unfamiliar sound. Each time she closed her eyes, she imagined the disappointment on her father's face if he could see her now, his educated daughter, abandoned at a remote way station. Too proud to admit she had made a terrible mistake. By midnight, exhaustion had finally overcome fear. Violet's head drooped against her chest, her body slumping sideways onto her luggage. Her dreams were troubled, filled with images of endless roads and unreachable destinations. She didn't hear the approach of wagon wheels on the packed dirt road. She didn't notice when they slowed to a stop nearby. She remained unaware as a tall figure approached, boots crunching softly on the ground. Caleb Irvine had not planned to stop at the old way station. At 30 years old, he had traveled this route between his ranch and Promise Creek countless times, usually passing the abandoned platform without a second glance. But something, perhaps the unusual shape against the moonlit backdrop, had caught his attention. When he realized it was a woman, alone and asleep in such a vulnerable position, he felt a surge of concern. This was no place for anyone to spend the night, least of all a young woman traveling alone. He approached cautiously, not wanting to frighten her. "Miss." He called softly, keeping his distance. When she didn't respond, he moved closer. "Miss, are you all right?" Violet remained deeply asleep, her body having surrendered to exhaustion after hours of vigilance. In the silvery moonlight, Caleb could see she was young, probably not much older than 20, with auburn hair escaping from what had once been a neat arrangement. Her clothing, though dusty, was of good quality, not the garb of a woman accustomed to frontier hardships. He stood for a moment, considering his options. He couldn't leave her here. Night predators, both animal and human, made the location far too dangerous. Promise Creek was still a fair distance away, and waking her might only cause unnecessary fear. With practiced gentleness born from years of handling skittish horses, Caleb carefully gathered the sleeping woman into his arms. She stirred slightly but didn't wake, her head instinctively finding the crook of his shoulder. He was struck by how light she felt, how fragile compared to the hardy women he typically encountered in these parts. After securing her luggage in the back of his wagon, he placed her on the bench seat, arranging a folded blanket to cushion her head against the wooden side. She murmured something unintelligible, but remained asleep as he climbed up beside her and set the horses in motion toward Promise Creek. As the wagon rumbled along the uneven road, Caleb occasionally glanced at his unexpected passenger. Under the moonlight, with tendrils of hair falling across her face, she presented a picture of vulnerability that stirred protective instincts he hadn't realized he possessed. He wondered what circumstances had brought her to this remote location alone and what awaited her in Promise Creek. The gentle rocking of the wagon eventually disrupted Violet's sleep. Her eyes fluttered open to unfamiliar surroundings and movement. For a moment, disorientation kept her still, until the realization that she was no longer at the way station struck her with sudden clarity. She bolted upright with a gasp. "Easy now," came a deep voice beside her. "You're safe." Violet turned sharply to find herself seated next to a man whose features were partially obscured by shadow and the wide brim of his hat. Panic surged through her as she pressed herself against the far side of the bench. "Who are you? Where are you taking me?" Her voice emerged higher and more tremulous than she would have liked. "Name's Caleb Irvine." "I'm heading to Promise Creek, which I'm guessing was your destination before you fell asleep at that way station." His voice remained calm, steady, as he kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Your luggage is in the back. Didn't seem right leaving you there all night." Violet's heart continued to race, but the mention of Promise Creek gave her pause. She glanced over her shoulder and indeed saw her 2 leather cases secured in the wagon bed. You shouldn't have moved me without permission," she said, though her indignation was tempered by the realization that he had likely saved her from a night of increasing discomfort and potential danger. "You're right about that," he conceded easily. "But waking a woman alone in the dark seemed likely to cause more fear than help. I apologize if I frightened you." In the growing moonlight, Violet could better make out his features' strong jawline covered in several days' worth of beard, straight nose, and eyes that appeared to be studying the road with intense concentration. He wore the practical clothing of a working man: denim pants, leather vest over a cotton shirt, and a weathered hat that had seen many seasons. "Are you from Promise Creek, Mr. Irvine?" she asked, maintaining formality despite their unusual introduction. "Got a ranch about 3 miles outside town, raise horses mostly," he answered. "And you, what brings a lady like yourself to our corner of Wyoming?" "I'm to be the new schoolteacher," Violet said, straightening her posture with a touch of pride. "Miss Violet James." "I was expected today, but the stagecoach driver refused to continue to Promise Creek after an argument with another passenger." Caleb nodded, a small smile forming. "Ah, you must be the teacher Mayor Henderson's been talking about for weeks." "Town's been without proper schooling since Miss Whittaker left last winter to get married." The confirmation that she was indeed expected brought a wave of relief to Violet. The fear that she had traveled all this distance only to find the position already filled had been gnawing at her. "Is it much farther?" she asked, trying to spot signs of civilization in the darkness ahead. "Another hour, maybe less," Caleb replied. "We should arrive before the town's completely asleep. Mrs. Peterson at the boarding house keeps a light burning for late arrivals." As they continued their journey, Violet's initial fear gradually subsided. Caleb maintained a respectful distance on the bench and spoke in the measured tones of a man accustomed to calming nervous creatures. He pointed out landmarks barely visible in the moonlight, distant mountains, a creek that caught silver reflections, the occasional cluster of trees breaking up the vast prairie. "Have you lived here long, Mr. Irvine?" Violet asked, finding conversation preferable to uncomfortable silence. "Since '68. Came west after the war with not much more than the clothes on my back and a knack for handling horses," he said. "Started working at the Thompson place, saved enough to buy a small plot when old man Crawford decided to move back east, been building it up ever since." Violet nodded, trying to imagine the determination required to forge a life from nothing in this untamed landscape. Her own journey suddenly seemed less daunting by comparison. "And what made you decide to teach on the frontier, Miss James? There must be more comfortable positions back east." His question held genuine curiosity without judgment. Violet hesitated, unsure how much of her story to share with this stranger who had both disturbed and rescued her. "My mother was a teacher," she finally said. "She believed education was the greatest gift one could offer. After she passed last year, I wanted to honor her memory by bringing that gift to children who might otherwise go without." It wasn't the entire truth. She had omitted the crushing debts her father faced, the pressure from a persistent suitor 3 times her age, and the suffocating grief that had made Philadelphia unbearable. But it was truth enough for a moonlit conversation with a man she had just met. Caleb nodded, seeming to sense the deeper currents beneath her words. "Noble purpose. The children here need someone who believes in education. Most of their parents are too busy surviving to worry much about reading and figures." The wagon crested a small rise, and suddenly, the scattered lights of Promise Creek appeared in the distance. Though modest compared to what Violet was accustomed to, the warm glow of lanterns and windows represented sanctuary after her ordeal. "There it is," Caleb said, a note of fondness in his voice. "Not much to look at, but decent folks mostly." As they approached the town, Violet became acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. She hastily attempted to tuck stray hairs back into place and brush dust from her skirts, conscious of the impression she would make on her arrival. "Don't worry," Caleb said, noticing her efforts with a small smile. "Mrs. Peterson has seen far worse than a lady who's had a difficult journey. She's been running that boarding house for 15 years and has a gift for making people feel at home." The wagon rolled down the main street of Promise Creek, passing darkened storefronts and the occasional saloon still glowing with activity. A few men on the boardwalk tipped their hats at Caleb, eyeing Violet with undisguised curiosity. True to Caleb's word, the boarding house at the end of the street displayed a welcoming lantern by its door. The 2-story wooden structure with its neat front porch and curtained windows looked like paradise to Violet's weary eyes. Caleb brought the wagon to a stop and jumped down, coming around to offer Violet his hand. She hesitated only briefly before accepting it, aware that her legs might be unsteady after the long journey. His grip was firm but gentle as he helped her down to solid ground. "Thank you, Mr. Irvine," she said formally, withdrawing her hand once she was steady. "I appreciate your assistance, even if the manner of it was unconventional." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he retrieved her luggage from the wagon. "Sometimes the frontier calls for unconventional solutions, Miss James. You might find that's a lesson worth learning early in your stay here." Before she could respond, the door of the boarding house opened, spilling warm light onto the porch. A plump woman in her 50s stood framed in the doorway, her gray hair neatly pinned beneath a lace cap. Caleb Irvine, what are you doing arriving at this hour with the woman stopped, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of Violet. Oh, you must be our new schoolteacher. We'd given up hope when you didn't arrive on the afternoon stage, Mrs. Peterson. This is Miss Violet James, Caleb introduced. Found her asleep at the old Cottonwood station. Seems the stage left her there rather than continuing to town. The woman's face clouded with indignation. That Hargrove and his shortcuts. I've told Mayor Henderson a dozen times we need a more reliable service. She bustled forward, taking Violet's arm with maternal concern. You poor dear, you must be exhausted. Come in, come in. I've kept some stew warming and your room is all prepared. Violet found herself swept into the boarding house before she could properly thank Caleb. She glanced back to see him still standing by his wagon, hat in hand, watching her departure with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Mr. Irvine, she called, pausing at the threshold. Thank you again, I'm in your debt. He replaced his hat with a slight nod. Welcome to Promise Creek, Miss James. I expect I'll be seeing you around town as Mrs. Peterson ushered her inside with promises of hot food and a warm bath. Violet couldn't help but look back one last time at the tall figure mounting his wagon. Something about the way Caleb Irvine had come to her rescue, unexpectedly, yet without fanfare, stirred a curiosity within her that even exhaustion couldn't diminish. The boarding house door closed behind her, and she stepped fully into her new life in Promise Creek, unaware that the cowboy who had lifted her so gently into his wagon would soon become far more significant than a chance rescuer on a moonlit night. The morning light streamed through lace curtains, rousing Violet from the deepest sleep she'd experienced in weeks. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind until the events of the previous night came flooding back the abandoned way station, falling asleep beside her luggage, and waking to find herself in the wagon of a stranger named Caleb Irvine. Now, surrounded by the simple comforts of her room at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house, the entire experience seemed almost dreamlike. The room was modest but clean, furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand with porcelain basin, a small writing desk, and a wardrobe that smelled pleasantly of cedar. It was a far cry from her family home in Philadelphia, but after her journey it felt like luxury. A soft knock at the door preceded Mrs. Peterson's cheerful voice. Miss James, are you awake, dear? Breakfast is nearly ready and several town folk are eager to meet you. Yes, thank you. I'll be down shortly, Violet called, hastily rising and reaching for her dressing gown. Within half an hour she had washed, dressed in a practical blue cotton dress, and arranged her hair in a simple but neat style appropriate for a schoolteacher. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and descended the stairs to begin her new life in Promise Creek. The boarding house dining room buzzed with conversation as Violet entered. 5 people sat around a large oak table laden with plates of eggs, bacon, biscuits, and preserves. All conversation ceased as she appeared in the doorway. Ah, here she is, Mrs. Peterson announced proudly. Everyone, this is Miss Violet James, our new schoolteacher. A portly man with impressive side whiskers rose from his seat. Miss James, welcome to Promise Creek. I'm Mayor Henderson. We were beginning to worry when you didn't arrive yesterday afternoon. Thank you, Mayor. I apologize for the delay, Violet replied with a polite smile. I'm grateful to Mr. Irvine for his assistance last night. Caleb's a good man, offered a gray-haired gentleman who introduced himself as Dr. Miller. Been doctoring in this town for 30 years, and I can tell you we've few as reliable as young Irvine. Introductions continued around the table. Mrs. Miller, the doctor's wife who also served as the town's midwife, Mr. Thompson, owner of the general store, and Miss Winters, a spinster who played organ at the church and offered piano lessons to interested students. As Violet took her seat and accepted a plate heaped with more food than she typically ate in an entire day, the conversation turned to the school and her duties. School term starts in 2 weeks, Mayor Henderson explained between bites of biscuit. We've about 30 children of school age in town and from the surrounding farms. The schoolhouse needs some attention. Roof leaks in one corner, and the stove smokes something terrible when the wind's from the north. I've organized a work party for Saturday, Mr. Thompson added. Some of the men will make repairs while the ladies clean and ready the interior. You're welcome to join us, Miss James, to see your new domain. Violet nodded enthusiastically. I'd appreciate that very much. I'm eager to assess what books and materials are available. Not much, I'm afraid, Miss Winters said with a sniff. The last teacher took half the library with her when she left to get married, said they were her personal books, though I have my doubts. The conversation flowed around Violet as she ate, trying to absorb every detail about her new home. The citizens of Promise Creek seemed welcoming, if plain-spoken. Their frontier directness was refreshing after the veiled meanings and social subterfuge she had grown accustomed to in Philadelphia society. After breakfast, Mayor Henderson offered to show Violet the schoolhouse. They walked down the town's main street, the mayor pointing out establishments she should know: the general store, the small bank, the sheriff's office, the church that doubled as a meeting hall, and 2 saloons that she was advised to give a wide berth. Not that they're terrible establishments, the mayor hastened to add. Tucker runs a clean place at the Silver Dollar, and even Delaney's watering hole has calmed down since Sheriff Mills ran the Colton brothers out of town. But a lady of your standing. Well, it wouldn't do for the children to see their teacher around such places. Violet understood the unspoken social boundaries being drawn and nodded her agreement. Her position would require exemplary behavior. Frontier towns often held their teachers to even higher standards than those back east. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple one-room building with a small bell tower. Inside, Violet found rows of rough-hewn benches and desks, a teacher's desk on a slightly raised platform, a blackboard that had seen better days, and a pot-bellied stove that indeed showed signs of poor ventilation. It's not much, Mayor Henderson said apologetically, but with some cleaning and repairs, it should serve well enough. The town council has approved funds for new books and slates, though they won't arrive until the stage brings them from Cheyenne. Violet walked slowly through the room, trailing her fingers along the desks, imagining them filled with students eager to learn. Despite the building's shortcomings, she felt a surge of purpose. This was why she had come west, to bring education to children who might otherwise go without. It will be perfect once we've addressed the repairs, she assured the mayor. I've brought some of my own books that we can use until the new ones arrive. The mayor beamed at her positive response. Excellent, I knew you'd be the right choice when I read your letter of application. Now let me show you the teacher's quarters. Adjacent to the schoolhouse was a small cabin, just one room with a lean-to kitchen attached. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand, a small table with 2 chairs, and a bookshelf that stood mostly empty. A braided rug covered part of the wooden floor, and calico curtains hung at the single window. It's traditional for our teacher to live here during the school term, the mayor explained. Mrs. Peterson is happy to have you at the boarding house until you're settled, of course, but this will be more convenient once classes begin. Violet surveyed the modest accommodations with mixed feelings. The cabin offered privacy and independence, but its isolation might prove lonely after the communal atmosphere of the boarding house. Still, she had come to the frontier prepared for hardship and simplicity. It's charming, she said diplomatically. I look forward to making it my home. As they walked back toward town, Violet's attention was drawn to a commotion near the general store. A wagon had pulled up, and several men were unloading crates and barrels. She recognized the tall figure directing the activity even before the mayor waved and called out a greeting. Irvine. Come meet our new teacher properly in the daylight. Caleb handed a crate to one of his workers and approached, removing his hat as he neared Violet and the mayor. In the clear light of day, she could see him more distinctly than during their moonlit journey. He was taller than she had realized, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscular build of a man accustomed to physical labor. His face was weathered from sun and wind, but handsome in a rugged way, with keen blue eyes that studied her with undisguised interest. "Miss James," he said with a slight nod, "you're looking better rested than when we last met." Violet felt her cheeks warm at the reminder of how he had found her disheveled and vulnerable in sleep. "Yes, thank you again for your assistance, Mr. Irvine, Mrs. Peterson's hospitality has been most restorative. Caleb was just telling me about finding you at Cottonwood Station," Mayor Henderson said, shaking his head. "Disgraceful of Hargrove to leave you there. I'll be having words with the stage company." "No permanent harm done," Caleb remarked, his eyes still on Violet, "though it might have been a different story if I hadn't been passing by." The implication of potential danger made Violet's stomach tighten, though she kept her expression composed. "Providence seems to have been watching over me." "Providence and Caleb's habit of taking the long way home," the mayor chuckled. "He usually cuts across his own land rather than passing the old station." Caleb shrugged, a slight smile playing at his lips. Had supplies to pick up, decided to enjoy the moonlight. There was something in his tone that made Violet wonder if there was more to his choice of route, but before she could ponder it further, the mayor was speaking again. "Irvine here raises the finest horses in the territory, supplies the army at Fort Laramie, and has even sent stock as far as Denver. If you need a mount during your time with us, Miss James, you do well to consult him." "I'm afraid I have little experience with horses," Violet admitted. "In Philadelphia, we traveled primarily by carriage or streetcar." "All the more reason to learn," Caleb said. "Getting around these parts without a horse is like trying to swim without water. I'd be happy to help you find a suitable mount when you're settled." Before Violet could respond, one of Caleb's workers called for his attention, indicating a problem with one of the crates. He excused himself with another tip of his hat, leaving Violet watching his retreating figure with a curious mixture of gratitude and something less easily defined. "Fine man, Irvine," the mayor commented as they continued their walk. "Started with nothing, now runs one of the most successful operations in the county. Never married, though not for lack of interested parties. Some say he's married to that ranch of his." Violet nodded politely, though she found herself surprisingly interested in this detail about Caleb's personal life. It seemed odd that a man of his evident capability and character would remain unmarried in a territory where eligible men outnumbered women significantly. The remainder of the day passed in a whirlwind of introductions and orientation. Violet met the sheriff, a taciturn man named Mills who offered a curt welcome and a warning about keeping the schoolhouse door locked at night. She visited the general store, where Mr. Thompson's wife showed her the selection of writing supplies and books available for purchase. She was measured for a new pair of sturdy boots by Mr. Lieberman, the German cobbler whose thick accent made conversation challenging. By late afternoon, when she returned to the boarding house for supper, Violet's head was swimming with new names, faces, and information. She was grateful for the quiet of her room afterwards, where she unpacked her belongings and wrote a letter to her father informing him of her safe arrival. As she prepared for bed, her thoughts drifted unbidden to Caleb Irvine, the way he had lifted her, still sleeping, into his wagon, the respectful distance he had maintained during their journey, his offer to help her find a suitable horse. There was something compelling about his quiet confidence and the evident respect he commanded in town. Violet shook her head, chiding herself for such thoughts. She had come to Promise Creek to teach, to honor her mother's memory, and to escape the constraints of her previous life, not to develop an interest in a local rancher, regardless of how intriguing he might be. With determined focus, she reviewed her plans for the coming days, organizing the schoolhouse, developing lesson plans, and preparing for her students. Yet as sleep claimed her, it was not the faces of imagined pupils that filled her dreams, but blue eyes bright with intelligence and a voice deep and steady as the Wyoming night. The week that followed kept Violet so busy she scarcely had time to think about Caleb Irvine or the peculiar circumstances of their meeting. Saturday's community work party transformed the schoolhouse from a neglected building into a proper place of learning. Men repaired the roof, fixed broken windows, and built a new woodshed, while women scoured floors, washed windows, and hung fresh curtains sewn by the Ladies' Aid Society. Violet worked alongside them, cataloging the meager selection of books remaining on the shelves and adding those she had brought from Philadelphia. She organized the teacher's desk, repaired torn maps, and wrote out alphabet charts to hang on the walls. By sundown, the schoolhouse stood ready for its new purpose, and the community celebrated with a potluck supper on the grounds. Caleb arrived late to the gathering, having spent the day mending his own fences rather than helping at the school. Violet caught sight of him standing at the edge of the crowd, plate in hand, listening to Mr. Thompson's animated story about a bear encounter. Something tightened in her chest when he looked up, and their eyes met briefly across the schoolyard. He nodded in acknowledgement, a small smile touching his lips, before returning his attention to the conversation. Throughout the evening, Violet found herself unexpectedly aware of his movements, even as she engaged in conversations with her new neighbors and accepted their well-meant advice about handling frontier children. She noticed when he spoke with the mayor, when he helped Mrs. Miller to a seat, when he declined a piece of pie from a young woman who offered it with obvious admiration. It was foolish, this awareness. She had exchanged barely 50 words with the man, yet found herself unreasonably disappointed when he departed early without speaking to her directly. Scolding herself for such schoolgirl sentiments, Violet redoubled her efforts to connect with the parents of her future students, memorizing names and family relationships that would serve her well when classes began. The following week, Violet moved into the teacher's quarters despite Mrs. Peterson's protests that she would be too isolated. The small cabin felt cavernously empty at first, each creak and settling noise magnified in the silence. But Violet was determined to establish independence, arranging her books and personal belongings to create a semblance of home. On Wednesday afternoon, as she was returning from the general store with supplies, she spotted a familiar wagon outside the sheriff's office. Without conscious thought, she slowed her pace, adjusting the parcels in her arms. Moments later, Caleb emerged from the building, deep in conversation with Sheriff Mills. He looked up as Violet approached, his serious expression warming. "Miss James," he greeted, touching the brim of his hat, "settling in well?" "Yes, thank you," she replied, suddenly conscious of her windblown appearance. "Everyone has been most welcoming." Sheriff Mills excused himself with a nod, leaving them alone on the boardwalk. An awkward silence threatened until Caleb gestured to her parcels. "Those look heavy." "May I help you with them?" "Oh, they're not so very," Violet began, but he had already reached for the largest package, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. The brief contact shouldn't have been noteworthy, yet she found herself momentarily flustered. "I'm heading toward the schoolhouse anyway," Caleb said easily. "Promised Mayor Henderson I'd look at that stove before winter sets in." They walked side by side down the dusty street, Caleb shortening his stride to match hers. Violet searched for something to say that wouldn't sound trivial or overly formal. "Have you lived in Promise Creek your entire life, Mr. Irvine?" she finally asked. He shook his head. "Grew up in Kentucky. Fought for the Union during the war, then came west like thousands of other restless souls afterward." His tone was matter-of-fact, without the bitterness she had heard in many veterans' voices. "What about you? What made Philadelphia too small for a lady like yourself?" There was gentle humor in his question, but perceptiveness too. Violet considered how to answer without revealing too much of her past. "I needed a change," she said simply, "and the opportunity to teach where it might make a genuine difference." Caleb studied her profile for a moment. "There's more to it than that, I suspect, but everyone's entitled to their secrets in this country. Half the men in Wyoming Territory are running from something: the law, debts, women, memories." He shrugged. "Out here, most folks judge you by what you do, not what you've done." His understanding without prying relieved her. "Is that why you chose Wyoming, to make a fresh start?" A smile touched his eyes. "Partly. Mostly I fell in love with the land, all this open space." First time I rode through these parts, I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time in years. Violet understood that sentiment. Even in her short time here, she had been struck by the vastness of the landscape, the endless sky that somehow made human troubles seem smaller and more manageable. They reached the schoolhouse, and Caleb set her package down on the porch. "I'll just take a look at that stove now, if you don't mind." Violet unlocked the door and led him inside, watching as he knelt to examine the problematic stove. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the flue and inspecting the seams where smoke had previously escaped. "Problem's simpler than I thought," he announced after a few minutes. "Flue pipe needs replacing and this gasket here is shot. I've got the materials at my ranch. Could fix it tomorrow if you're agreeable." "That would be wonderful," Violet said, relieved that the repair would be completed well before classes began. "What time shall I expect you?" "Mid-morning, likely. Got to see to my horses first." He stood, brushing dust from his hands. "Speaking of horses, have you given any thought to getting a mount of your own? Winter comes early here and walking to town could be treacherous once the snow flies." Violet hesitated. "I confess the idea intimidates me. I've ridden only occasionally and never without assistance." Caleb considered this. "What if I brought a gentle mare for you to try, no obligation, just to see if you might take to riding with some practice?" The offer was tempting. Violet had already discovered that the half-mile walk between her cabin and the center of town could feel much longer in inclement weather or darkness. "That's very kind," she said. "Perhaps after you've fixed the stove, it's settled then." He smiled, a full smile that transformed his weathered face and reached his eyes. "A riding lesson for a schoolteacher. Seems a fair exchange." As he departed, Violet found herself looking forward to the next day with unexpected eagerness. She told herself it was merely anticipation of having the stove repaired and possibly finding suitable transportation. It had nothing to do with the warmth of Caleb's smile or the quiet strength he projected. That night, as she prepared for bed in her small cabin, a coyote howled in the distance, reminding her of her first night in Wyoming Territory. How vulnerable she had been then, sleeping beside her luggage at the abandoned station. And how her life had changed direction because Caleb Irvine had happened to pass by at precisely the right moment. Coincidence or fate? Violet wasn't certain, but as she drifted towards sleep, she acknowledged that her interest in the rancher went beyond simple gratitude. There was something compelling about him, a depth beneath his straightforward manner, a gentleness underlying his strength. It was a combination that intrigued her far more than the polished manners of Philadelphia's eligible bachelors ever had. Morning brought clear skies and a brisk autumn wind that rattled the cabin windows. Violet dressed with particular care, selecting a practical brown skirt and cream shirtwaist that flattered her coloring without appearing too deliberately chosen. She braided her auburn hair and pinned it in a coronet that was both neat and becoming. At precisely 10 o'clock, she heard the approach of a wagon. Looking through the window, she saw Caleb pulling up outside the schoolhouse, a second horse, a dainty chestnut mare tethered to the back of the wagon. Violet's heart quickened as she gathered her shawl and stepped outside. Caleb was already unloading tools and materials from his wagon, his movements efficient and purposeful. "Good morning, Miss James," he called, tipping his hat. "Perfect day for stove repairs and riding lessons, wouldn't you say?" And so began a day that would alter the course of Violet's life in ways she could never have anticipated, though neither of them knew it yet, as the Wyoming sun climbed higher in an impossibly blue autumn sky. Caleb worked on the stove with methodical precision, explaining each step as Violet observed from a respectful distance. His hands were calloused but dexterous, handling tools with the same gentle confidence she had noticed in his interactions with horses. "My father was a blacksmith," he explained as he fitted the new flue pipe. "Taught me to work metal before I could properly write my name, useful skill out here where there's not always someone else to fix what breaks." Violet, seated at her desk grading sample arithmetic problems she had created to assess her future students' levels, looked up with interest. Were you close to your father? A shadow crossed Caleb's face briefly. We understood each other. Not much for talking, my father, but he showed his care through teaching. He secured the pipe with a final twist. He didn't live to see the end of the war. Fever took him while I was fighting at Shiloh. I'm sorry, Violet said softly. It's difficult to lose a parent. Caleb glanced at her, seeming to hear the personal knowledge behind her words. Your mother, the teacher, you mentioned she passed recently. Violet nodded, surprised he had remembered that detail from their first conversation. Last spring, consumption, it was a lengthy illness. That's a hard way to lose someone, Caleb said, his voice gentle. Watching them fade bit by bit. Yes. Violet looked down at the papers before her, unseeing for a moment as memories surfaced her mother's increasingly frail form, the terrible coughing that no medicine seemed to ease, the final peaceful silence that had been both blessing and unbearable loss. A comfortable quiet settled between them, the kind that acknowledges shared understanding without requiring further words. Caleb returned to his work and Violet to her papers, but something had shifted, a recognition of common ground in the landscape of loss. By noon, the stove was repaired, and Caleb built a small test fire to ensure the smoke drew properly up the chimney. Satisfied with his work, he closed the stove door and dusted off his hands. Good as new, he announced. Should keep you warm through winter now without smoking you out. Thank you, Violet said sincerely. What do I owe you for the materials and your time? Caleb waved away her question. Consider it my contribution to education. Besides, he added with a slight smile, we had an exchange arranged, if you recall, stove repair for a riding lesson. Despite a flutter of nervousness, Violet nodded. I remember, though I should warn you, I may prove a disappointing student. I've yet to meet a horse or human that couldn't learn with proper instruction and patience, Caleb responded confidently. Let me wash up, and we'll see about introducing you to Maple. She's the gentlest mare in my string, raised her from a foal myself. Outside, the chestnut mare waited patiently, occasionally switching her tail or lowering her head to investigate a patch of grass near the hitching post. Violet approached cautiously, remembering childhood warnings about standing behind horses and making sudden movements. She's beautiful, Violet offered, admiring the mare's glossy coat and intelligent eyes. And she knows it, Caleb chuckled, coming to stand beside her. Maple has a lady's vanity and a saint's patience, perfect combination for a beginner's mount. He showed Violet how to approach from the side, speaking in low, even tones to both horse and student. Let her see and smell you first. Horses are prey animals, they need to know you're not a threat. Violet extended her hand as directed, palm flat, and the mare stretched her neck to investigate, warm breath tickling her skin. The velvet softness of Maple's muzzle against her palm brought an involuntary smile to Violet's face. She's so gentle, she marveled. Most are when treated with respect, Caleb replied, watching the interaction with evident pleasure. Now, let's show you how the saddle works before you mount up. The next hour passed in a series of careful instructions: how to check the cinch, how to use the reins, how to sit properly in the saddle. When the time came for Violet to actually mount the horse, Caleb positioned himself beside the mare, one hand holding the bridle, the other ready to assist. Left foot in the stirrup, grab the saddle here and push yourself up, he directed. I'll help steady you. Violet gathered her skirts as modestly as possible and followed his instructions, gasping slightly as she found herself suddenly elevated on the horse's back. Caleb's hand at her waist steadied her until she found her balance. There now, he said approvingly, you look like you were born to it. Violet doubted this assessment, feeling precarious and far too high above the ground, but Maple stood perfectly still beneath her, seemingly untroubled by her rider's inexperience. I'll lead you around the schoolyard first, so you can get accustomed to the movement, Caleb said, keeping one hand on the bridle as he began walking the horse in a slow circle. Gradually, Violet relaxed into the rhythm of the mare's motion, her initial tension easing as she realized the saddle held her securely. After several circuits, Caleb showed her how to use the reins to direct the horse. first with him walking alongside, then with him standing in the center of the yard providing verbal guidance. By the end of the lesson, Violet had mastered basic starts, stops, and turns, her confidence growing with each small success. The sensation of partnership with the animal beneath her was unlike anything she had experienced, both empowering and humbling. "You're a natural, Miss James," Caleb said as he helped her dismount, his hands at her waist briefly supporting her weight as her feet found the ground. "With a few more lessons, you'll be riding to town on your own in no time." Violet's legs felt strangely unsteady after the unaccustomed activity, and she remained within the circle of his supportive hands a moment longer than strictly necessary. Looking up, she found his face closer than expected, his blue eyes warm with approval. "Thank you for your patience," she said, suddenly aware of their proximity and the impropriety of being alone with a man at her isolated cabin. She stepped back, smoothing her skirts. "It was far less intimidating than I feared." Caleb seemed to sense her discomfort and moved to give her space, turning his attention to checking Maple's saddle. "Horses respond to confidence," he said over his shoulder. "Show fear, they get skittish. Show calm, they mirror it back. Is that your philosophy for life as well, Mr. Irvine?" Violet asked, curious about the man behind the composed exterior. He paused, considering her question seriously. "Suppose it is, in part. Though there's times when acknowledging fear is the wiser course, the key is not letting it make your decisions for you." It was a surprisingly thoughtful response from a man who worked primarily with his hands, reminding Violet yet again not to make assumptions about education or intelligence based on occupation or location. "Would you care for some refreshment before you leave?" She offered, gesturing toward her cabin. "I could make coffee, or I have lemonade already prepared." A shadow of regret crossed Caleb's face. "Another time, perhaps, I should get back to the ranch, left my foreman handling a new stallion that needs a firm hand." He untied Maple and secured her behind his wagon once more. "But I'd be happy to continue your riding lessons if you're interested. Say, Saturday afternoon, I could bring Maple by around 2 o'clock. "I would appreciate that very much," Violet said, pleased by the prospect of further instruction and further opportunity to know this intriguing man better. Caleb nodded, seemingly equally pleased by her acceptance. "Saturday at 2, then." He climbed onto the wagon seat, gathering the reins. "In the meantime, if you need anything at all, most folks in town know how to get word to my ranch." As his wagon pulled away, Violet remained on the schoolhouse steps, watching until he disappeared around the bend in the road. The day had brought unexpected connections, shared memories of lost parents, the beginning of a skill that would serve her well in this new life, and a deepening fascination with Caleb Irvine that both excited and unnerved her. That evening, as she prepared a simple supper in her small kitchen, Violet found herself humming a tune her mother used to sing, something she hadn't done since, before the illness took hold. The realization stopped her mid-note, a lump forming in her throat at the bittersweet memory. Yet the grief felt different, somehow still present, but less consuming, as if the vast Wyoming sky had created space around it, allowing other emotions to exist alongside it. Perhaps this was part of healing, this gradual ability to remember with love rather than only pain. As she ate her meal, Violet's thoughts returned to Caleb and his quiet understanding when she mentioned her mother's passing. There had been no awkward platitudes, no changing of the subject, just recognition of a shared experience that needed no elaboration. Such directness was refreshing after Philadelphia society's carefully constructed conversations, where real emotions were considered improper for public display. Here, hardship was acknowledged as a common element of life, neither hidden nor dwelt upon unnecessarily. Preparing for bed later, Violet caught herself looking forward to Saturday with an eagerness that extended beyond the practical benefits of learning to ride. She chided herself for this schoolgirl sentiment, even as she wondered what other aspects of Caleb's character might be revealed during their next encounter. School was scheduled to begin the following Monday, and Violet knew she should focus her energy on final preparations for her students. Yet as she drifted towards sleep, it was not lesson plans that filled her mind but the memory of strong hands steadying her waist and blue eyes bright with approval as she mastered each new riding skill. The remainder of the week passed in a flurry of activity as Violet finalized her classroom arrangements and familiarized herself with the curriculum materials available. Parents began stopping by with children in tow, introducing themselves, and sometimes bringing small, welcome gifts: home canned preserves, fresh eggs, a hand-knitted scarf for the coming winter. Violet met each family with genuine warmth, making mental notes about each child's personality and apparent educational level. By Friday evening, she felt reasonably prepared for her first day of teaching, though anticipation kept her awake long after she had retired to bed. Saturday dawned clear and crisp, with the first hint of frost silvering the grass outside her window. Violet spent the morning reviewing her lesson plans one final time, then changed into her riding clothes, a practical dark blue skirt and sturdy boots suitable for mounting a horse. At precisely 2 o'clock, she heard the approach of hoofbeats and looked out to see Caleb riding toward the schoolhouse, leading the chestnut mare behind him. Instead of his usual work clothes, he wore a clean shirt and what appeared to be newer denims, his hair still damp from recent washing. The sight of him made her heart beat a little faster, a reaction she attempted to dismiss as she stepped outside to greet him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Irvine. You're precisely on time. Punctuality's important with horses," he replied, dismounting with easy grace. "They appreciate routine." He tipped his hat, eyes taking in her riding attire with approval. "You look prepared for a proper lesson today." "I hope to be a more adept student than last time," Violet said, approaching Maple with growing confidence, stroking the mare's neck as Caleb had shown her. "You were already impressive for a beginner," he assured her. "Today we'll work on moving beyond the schoolyard. Think you're ready for a short trail ride." Excitement and trepidation mingled in Violet's chest at the prospect. "If you believe I'm capable, I'm willing to try." "I wouldn't suggest it otherwise," Caleb said simply, his confidence in her abilities bolstering her courage. With his assistance, Violet mounted Maple, adjusting her seat as he had taught her. This time the height seemed less intimidating, the saddle more familiar beneath her. Caleb checked the stirrups and reins before mounting his own horse, a powerful black gelding that stood several hands taller than Maple. "We'll take it slow," he promised, bringing his mount alongside hers. "Just follow my lead and remember what I showed you about using the reins." They set off at a walk, Caleb guiding them along a gentle trail that skirted the edge of town before winding into open meadowland. The day was perfect for riding warm sunshine tempered by a cool breeze, the landscape painted in autumn colors of gold, russet, and bronze. As they rode, Caleb pointed out landmarks and offered quiet suggestions for improving her posture or grip on the reins. Violet found herself relaxing into the rhythm of Maple's movements, beginning to enjoy the sensation of partnership with the animal beneath her. "You mentioned your father was a blacksmith," she said after they had ridden in comfortable silence for a while. "Did you consider following his trade?" Caleb nodded, eyes on the trail ahead. "Worked the forge with him from the time I could lift a hammer." "Might have continued if the war hadn't come." His expression grew distant. "After Shiloh and Vicksburg and all that followed, couldn't see myself standing at an anvil day after day, needed space, sky overhead, freedom to move." Violet understood the sentiment, even without the terrible experience of war to drive it. "Is that why you chose horses?" A smile softened his features. "Partly. Always had a way with them, even as a boy. My father's customers used to say I could calm the most fractious colt just by standing near it." He shrugged, modest about this gift. "Horses make sense to me. They don't lie or pretend. If they're angry or scared or content, you know it plain as day." "Unlike people," Violet observed thoughtfully. "Unlike most," Caleb agreed, glancing at her with unexpected intensity. "Though I've found some humans are more straightforward than others." Before Violet could respond to this observation that seemed to include her, a rabbit darted across the path, startling Maple. The mare sidestepped nervously and Violet gasped, clutching the saddle as she felt herself listing to one side. In an instant, Caleb was beside her, one strong hand steadying her while the other caught Maple's bridle. "Easy now," he said, his calm voice directed at both horse and rider. "Nothing to fear, just a rabbit about its business." Violet's heart thundered in her chest, more from the near fall than actual danger. Caleb's hand remained at her waist until she had regained her balance and composure. "I'm all right," she assured him, though she was grateful for his quick response. "Just startled." "You did well," he said approvingly. "Didn't panic or pull too hard on the reins. That's half the battle with horses, keeping your head when something unexpected happens." They continued their ride, eventually stopping beside a small creek where the horses could drink. Caleb helped Violet dismount, his hands lingering briefly at her waist as her feet touched the ground. Her legs felt wobbly after the unaccustomed exercise, and she was glad of his steadying presence. "How are you finding Promise Creek so far?" he asked as they settled on a fallen log while the horses grazed nearby. "Beyond the riding lessons, I mean." Violet considered the question thoughtfully. "It's different from anything I've known before, simpler in some ways, more challenging in others." She looked across the meadow where distant mountains rose against the horizon. "But there's a directness here that I find refreshing. People say what they mean." "Not always," Caleb said with a wry smile. "We have our share of schemers and smooth talkers. But generally, frontier life doesn't leave much room for pretense, too busy staying alive." "Is that why you've remained unmarried?" The question escaped before Violet could consider its propriety, and she immediately felt heat rush to her cheeks. "Forgive me, that was terribly forward." Rather than taking offense, Caleb seemed amused by her embarrassment. "It's a fair question, given my advanced age of 30. His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "Truth is, I was focused on building something solid before considering a wife. A man should have something worthwhile to offer." "And now," Violet asked, unable to curb her curiosity despite knowing better, "do you have something worthwhile to offer?" The amusement in his expression shifted to something more serious, more assessing. "I believe I do. The right woman would never want for comfort or stability." He paused, studying her with those perceptive blue eyes. "But she'd need to love the land as I do, understand that a ranch demands commitment that doesn't end when the sun sets." "That seems reasonable," Violet said, trying to maintain a conversational tone despite the intensity that had developed between them. "Any partnership requires shared values and expectations." "What about you, Miss James?" Caleb asked, turning the tables smoothly. "A lady of your qualities must have had suitors in Philadelphia. What brings you to Wyoming unattached?" It was Violet's turn to consider how much truth to reveal. "There were possibilities," she said carefully, "none that offered what I truly wanted, which was respect, partnership. The freedom to continue teaching rather than becoming merely a wife and mother." She looked down at her hands, remembering the persistent older suitor her father had favored, a man who had seen her education as an amusing novelty to be set aside after marriage. And perhaps something more intangible. A connection that transcends practical considerations. "Love," Caleb said simply, without mockery. Violet nodded, somewhat embarrassed by such a romantic notion coming from a practical schoolteacher. Foolish, perhaps, in a world where marriages are often matters of convenience or necessity. "Not foolish," he countered. "Rare, maybe, worth waiting for, certainly." He rose, offering his hand to help her up. "We should head back before the light begins to fade. Wouldn't want Promise Creek's new teacher to be caught out after dark before her first day of school." The ride back was quieter, both of them seemingly absorbed in their own thoughts after the unexpected depth of their conversation. As they approached the schoolhouse, Violet felt a curious mixture of regret that their time together was ending and anticipation for when they might next meet. Caleb helped her dismount one final time, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "You've made remarkable progress," he said as her feet touched the ground. "Another lesson or two and you'll be ready to ride on your own." "Thank you," Violet said sincerely. "For both the instruction and the company. It was a lovely afternoon." Something in her tone must have conveyed more than simple appreciation, for Caleb's expression softened as he looked down at her. For a breathless moment, Violet thought he might say or do something more personal than their previous interactions had allowed. Instead, he stepped back respectfully, touching the brim of his hat. "Good luck with your students on Monday, Miss James. They're fortunate to have such a dedicated teacher." As he mounted his horse and rode away, leading Maple behind him, Violet stood watching until he disappeared from view. Their conversation had revealed layers to Caleb Irvine that intrigued her further: his values, his perspective on marriage, his subtle indication that he might be ready for a partnership with the right woman. Whether she could or should be that woman remained an open question, one that Violet pushed aside as she turned her attention back to final preparations for the school term. Romance had no place in her immediate plans, regardless of how compelling she found a certain blue-eyed rancher. Yet that night, as she laid out her clothes for the first day of school and reviewed her welcome speech one final time, Violet found her thoughts returning to the afternoon's ride, to strong hands steadying her when she faltered, to candid conversation beside a sun-dappled creek, and to the unspoken connection that seemed to be developing between them despite her practical intentions. The school term began with 27 students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age and widely varying levels of previous education. Some of the farm children had received only sporadic instruction when weather and chores permitted, while others from town families had more consistent schooling. A few of the oldest boys attended only because their parents insisted, their expressions making clear they considered themselves men who had better things to do than sit at a desk. Violet approached this challenge with the same determination that had brought her across the country. She assessed each child's abilities, grouped them accordingly, and developed a system where advanced students helped instruct beginners while she worked with intermediate groups. By the end of the first week, even the reluctant older boys had grudgingly admitted that Miss James's lessons in practical mathematics and land surveying might prove useful in their future endeavors. The exhaustion that came with teaching multiple grade levels simultaneously was offset by the satisfaction of watching children grasp new concepts, their faces lighting with understanding or pride in accomplishment. Violet found herself looking forward to each day, developing creative approaches to overcome the limited resources available in the small schoolhouse. News of the new teacher's effectiveness spread quickly through Promise Creek. Parents stopped her in the general store or after church to express appreciation for their children's sudden interest in books or improved behavior at home. Mayor Henderson made a point of publicly congratulating the school board for their excellent hiring decision. Amid this professional success, Violet saw little of Caleb Irvine. Autumn cattle sales kept him busy at distant markets, and their paths crossed only occasionally in town brief encounters that allowed for nothing more than polite greetings and inquiries about each other's health before duties called them in different directions. Yet each such meeting left Violet with a lingering awareness that colored her thoughts for hours afterward. The way his eyes sought hers across a crowded church social. How he seemed to listen more intently when she spoke than to others in group conversations. The fact that he always seemed to know which day she dismissed school early for teacher planning, appearing in town precisely when she would be walking home. October brought the first snow flurries and increasingly cold mornings. Violet had mastered the art of building a proper fire in the newly repaired schoolhouse stove, arriving early each day to warm the room before her students arrived. Her small cabin remained comfortable enough, though she had taken to wearing multiple layers and keeping extra blankets on her bed. One particularly bitter Tuesday, Violet dismissed school early when the snow began falling in earnest, wanting the children to reach home before conditions worsened. She was gathering her materials when a knock at the schoolhouse door revealed Sheriff Mills, his expression grave beneath his snow-dusted hat. "Miss James, thought I should warn you, got word of a storm coming in faster than expected. Thompson says his barometer's dropping like a stone." The sheriff stamped his boots, knocking off accumulated snow. Might be best if you stayed in town tonight rather than out here alone. Mrs. Peterson always keeps a room ready for you. Violet considered the darkening sky visible through the windows. Thank you for the warning, Sheriff. I'll gather some necessities and head to the boarding house shortly. Want me to wait and escort you, getting treacherous out there already? No need to trouble yourself, she assured him. I can manage the walk, it's not far. The sheriff nodded, though he looked doubtful. Don't delay too long. This has the makings of a proper blizzard. After he departed, Violet quickly organized the classroom, then hurried to her cabin to pack an overnight bag. The wind had intensified during even that short interval, driving snow horizontally across the schoolyard. By the time she had gathered her night clothes and morning necessities, visibility had deteriorated alarmingly. Violet stood at her cabin window, reconsidering her confident assertion to the sheriff. The path to town, normally visible from her door, had disappeared beneath swirling white. The half-mile distance suddenly seemed much greater, and the weight of her solitude pressed upon her with unexpected force. Before she could decide whether to attempt the journey or secure her cabin for an isolated night, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the howling wind. Moments later, a large, dark shape materialized from the blizzard, a horse and rider, moving purposefully toward her cabin. Violet's heart leapt with recognition even before the rider dismounted and approached her door. Caleb's tall figure was unmistakable despite being bundled against the storm, his shoulders dusted with snow as he knocked firmly. She opened the door immediately, relief washing through her. "Mr. Irvine, what brings you out in such weather?" "You do," he said simply, stamping snow from his boots before stepping inside. "Mills mentioned the school dismissed early. Thought you might need assistance getting to town." His eyes took in her packed bag. "Seems I was right. The sheriff suggested I stay at Mrs. Peterson's tonight," Violet explained, suddenly aware of how improper it was to have a man in her private quarters, however innocent the circumstances. "I was just preparing to leave." Caleb shook his head, moving to the window to assess the conditions. "Too dangerous to walk now. Visibility's down to nothing and the temperature's still dropping." He turned back to her, his expression serious. "I can take you on horseback, or—" He hesitated, clearly weighing propriety against safety, or, Violet prompted. "Or I could bring in more firewood, make sure you're properly supplied, and leave you secure here for the night," he finished. Though something in his tone suggested this wasn't his preferred option, Violet considered her alternatives. Remaining alone seemed increasingly unappealing, as the wind rattled her windows and howled around the cabin's corners. Yet riding through the blizzard presented its own dangers, and arriving at the boarding house on horseback with Caleb would certainly give rise to talk, however innocent their relationship. Before she could respond, a particularly violent gust shook the entire cabin, and the lamp on her table flickered ominously. "I think I would prefer to reach town if possible," she decided, practical concerns outweighing social niceties. "If you're certain it's safe to travel by horseback." "Safer than staying here if this storm worsens," Caleb said firmly. "Thunder knows the way even in poor visibility. We'll need to bundle you up properly, though." He helped her into her heaviest coat, then wrapped his own scarf around her neck and lower face for additional protection. The brief domestic intimacy of his assistance stirred something warm within Violet despite the circumstances, his hands careful yet confident as he secured each layer. "Keep your face turned away from the wind as much as possible," he instructed, helping her with her bag. "And hold tight to me during the ride. Don't worry about seeming forward. Safety matters more than propriety in weather like this." Outside, the storm had intensified further, snow falling so heavily it seemed to mute all other sounds except the persistent wind. Caleb's horse, a powerful black gelding, stood patiently beside the porch, already accumulating a coating of white on his broad back. With practiced efficiency, Caleb secured Violet's bag to the saddle, then mounted and reached down to help her up behind him. She hesitated only briefly before placing her foot on his offered boot and allowing him to pull her up. The necessity of wrapping her arms around his waist to maintain her position brought a flush to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold. "Ready?" he asked over his shoulder, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Yes," she replied, tightening her hold as the horse began to move. The journey to town was both terrifying and exhilarating. Snow stung Violet's exposed skin despite her turned face and multiple layers. The world had narrowed to a white void, landmarks completely obscured, leaving her entirely dependent on Caleb's knowledge and his horse's instincts. Yet there was something undeniably intimate about clinging to his solid warmth as they moved through the blizzard together, a shared adventure that transcended ordinary social boundaries. Caleb guided his horse with confident commands, occasionally reaching down to pat the animal's neck encouragingly or check that Violet remained secure behind him. Despite the blinding conditions, he maintained a steady pace that balanced speed with safety, his body a protective shield between Violet and the worst of the wind. When the lights of Promise Creek finally appeared through the swirling snow, Violet felt a mixture of relief and curious disappointment that their journey was ending. Caleb guided Thunder directly to the boarding house, where warm light glowed invitingly from frost-rimed windows. Before they had fully stopped, the front door opened to reveal Mrs. Peterson's worried face. "Miss James, Sheriff Mills said you might be caught out at the schoolhouse. Thank heavens Mr. Irvine had the sense to check on you." Caleb dismounted first, then carefully helped Violet down, his hands lingering supportively at her waist until he was certain her legs would support her after the cold ride. She was grateful for his steadying presence as they made their way to the porch, her limbs stiff and feet nearly numb despite her sturdy boots. "You're half frozen, both of you," Mrs. Peterson declared, ushering them inside. "Come in by the fire this instant. I've got coffee brewing and stew keeping warm." The boarding house's main parlor was blissfully warm after the bitter cold outside. Mrs. Peterson took Violet's coat and scarf, clicking her tongue at the snow encrusted on every fold, while Caleb removed his hat and outer layers more slowly, seeming reluctant to intrude. "I should see to Thunder," he said, glancing toward the door. "Get him stabled before the storm worsens." "Nonsense," Mrs. Peterson countered firmly. "The Miller boy is already taking care of your horse. Doctor's orders said you're to warm up properly before heading back out if you're fool enough to do so in this weather." She bustled toward the kitchen. "Sit down, both of you, while I fetch that coffee." Left momentarily alone in the parlor, Violet and Caleb stood awkwardly before the crackling fire, the intimate contact of their ride suddenly giving way to proper social distance. "Thank you," Violet said sincerely, finding her voice. "I dread to think what might have happened if I'd attempted to walk to town alone." "I wouldn't have let that happen," Caleb replied with quiet certainty. "Even if Sheriff Mills hadn't mentioned it, I would have checked on you once I saw the storm's direction." There was something in his tone, a protective devotion that went beyond neighborly concern that made Violet's heart beat faster despite her exhaustion. She met his gaze across the hearth rug, searching for confirmation of what she thought she had heard. Before either could speak further, Mrs. Peterson returned with a tray bearing steaming cups and bowls of fragrant stew. "Eat while it's hot," she instructed, setting the tray on a small table. "Miss James, I've prepared the blue room for you, and Mr. Irvine, you're welcome to one of the guest rooms as well. No sense risking your neck trying to reach your ranch in this." Caleb looked as if he might refuse the offer, but another glance at the window now completely obscured by driving snow appeared to change his mind. "That's very kind, Mrs. Peterson. I would appreciate a room for the night." As they ate their meal under Mrs. Peterson's watchful eye, conversation remained general: the storm's intensity, school matters, local news that Violet had missed during her busy teaching schedule. Yet beneath this ordinary exchange, something unspoken hummed between them, an awareness that had been building since their first meeting and seemed intensified by the day's shared adventure. When they finally bid each other goodnight in the upstairs hallway, Caleb paused outside Violet's door, his expression thoughtful in the lamplight. "I'm glad you're safe," he said simply. "Sleep well, Miss James." "And you, Mr. Irvine," she replied, finding it difficult to maintain formality after the intimacy of their storm-tossed ride. "Thank you again for coming to my rescue." A small smile touched his lips. "Seems to be developing into a habit." The reference to their first meeting her asleep beside her luggage until he lifted her gently into his wagon brought a corresponding smile to Violet's face. "Perhaps the third time I'll manage without requiring rescue." "Perhaps," he agreed, though something in his expression suggested he wouldn't mind if another opportunity arose. "Good night, Violet." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice lingered in her thoughts long after she had prepared for bed. As she listened to the storm raging outside her window, Violet acknowledged that something significant had shifted between them. Boundaries crossed. Connections deepened. Possibilities opened that hadn't existed before the blizzard forced them together. What those possibilities might lead to remained uncertain, but as she drifted towards sleep in the comfortable boarding house bed, Violet found herself more open to them than she had been to any romantic prospect in her previous life. There was something about Caleb Irvine, his quiet strength, his gentle competence, his underlying kindness that appealed to her in ways Philadelphia's polished suitors never had. Whether anything would come of this attraction was a question for another day. For now, it was enough to know he was nearby, that he had come for her when she needed assistance, and that tomorrow might bring opportunities to discover more about the man who had twice now appeared when she most needed someone to rely on. The blizzard raged for 2 days, forcing schools and businesses to close across Promise Creek. Trapped at the boarding house, Violet used the unexpected free time to catch up on grading and lesson planning, occasionally venturing downstairs to the communal spaces for meals or conversation with fellow lodgers. Caleb had attempted to return to his ranch the morning after their nighttime ride, only to be turned back by impassable drifts blocking the road out of town. His frustration at being separated from his responsibilities was evident, though he made efforts to conceal it behind stoic acceptance of the situation. "My foreman's capable," he told Violet as they shared breakfast in the dining room on the second day of the storm. "But I dislike not being there when conditions are harsh. Some of the younger horses haven't experienced a blizzard before." "You care deeply for them," Violet observed, noting the genuine concern in his expression. "They depend on me," he said simply. "That creates an obligation that matters more than personal comfort." It was a philosophy that resonated with Violet's own sense of duty toward her students. "I understand. I feel similarly about the children in my care, though the stakes are less immediate than yours." Caleb considered this, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "I wouldn't say less immediate, just different. You're shaping minds that will determine what this territory becomes in 20 years' time. That's no small responsibility." His recognition of the importance of her work warmed Violet more than the coffee before her. So many men, including her own father, viewed teaching as a temporary occupation for women before marriage, not a vocation with lasting significance. Their conversation continued throughout breakfast, touching on books they had both read, experiences that had shaped their perspectives and hopes for Promise Creek's future. With each exchange, Violet discovered new dimensions to Caleb that increased her admiration, his self-taught knowledge of history and natural science, his nuanced views on the territory's development, his respect for the indigenous people whose land had been taken to create settlements like Promise Creek. "My grandfather fought the Cherokee back in Tennessee," he explained, his expression somber. "Used to tell stories about it like they were great adventures. Wasn't until I saw what happened to tribes out here that I began questioning whether what he called progress was something to be entirely proud of." Such reflections revealed a depth of thought that surprised and impressed Violet, who had encountered few men willing to question the prevailing narrative of manifest destiny and civilization's advance. By the time the storm finally broke on the third morning, Violet and Caleb had spent hours in each other's company sharing meals, playing chess in the parlor while snow drifted against the windows, discussing everything from literature to horse breeding. The enforced proximity had accelerated their acquaintance beyond what months of formal social interaction might have accomplished. When Caleb finally departed for his ranch, concern for his animals outweighing the still difficult travel conditions, he paused at the boarding house door to bid Violet farewell. "School resumes tomorrow?" he asked, adjusting his hat as he prepared to face the bitter cold outside. "Yes, assuming the paths are sufficiently cleared," she confirmed. "The children will be eager to return after being confined indoors for days." Caleb nodded, hesitating as if there were more he wanted to say. Finally, he spoke with careful formality that didn't quite mask the warmth beneath. "Miss James Violet, I've enjoyed our conversations these past days. I would be honored if you would consider joining me for supper at Thompson's restaurant when I next come to town. Perhaps Saturday, if your duties permit." Though she had half expected such an invitation after their growing closeness, the actual request still brought a flush of pleasure to Violet's cheeks. "I would enjoy that very much, Mr. Irvine." "Caleb," he corrected gently. "After sharing a horse through a blizzard, I think we've earned the right to first names, don't you?" Violet smiled, acknowledging the truth in his observation. "Yes, Caleb, Saturday would be lovely." With that agreement between them, he departed into the snow-covered street, turning once to lift his hand in farewell before mounting Thunder and heading toward his ranch. Violet watched until he disappeared from view, aware that their relationship had irrevocably changed from chance acquaintances to something with definite intentions and possibilities. The following days passed in a blur of resumed school routines and preparation for their upcoming dinner. Violet found herself paying more attention to her appearance each morning, taking extra care with her hair and selecting her most becoming teaching dresses. She told herself this was professional pride, not an effort to impress Caleb should their paths cross before Saturday, but the flush that rose to her cheeks when she caught her own gaze in the mirror suggested otherwise. Saturday evening arrived clear and cold. The recent snow transformed into crystalline beauty by bright sunlight during the day and a full moon rising as Violet prepared for dinner. She selected her best dress, a deep burgundy wool with subtle lace detailing at collar and cuffs, and arranged her auburn hair in a more elaborate style than her usual teaching coronet. Mrs. Peterson knocked at her door just as she was securing the final hairpin. "Mr. Irvine is waiting downstairs," she announced with poorly concealed delight. The landlady had watched their growing connection with obvious approval during the storm days. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson." "I'll be down directly," Violet responded, checking her appearance one final time before gathering her shawl and reticule. Caleb waited in the boarding house parlor, dressed in what was clearly his best suit, not the latest Eastern fashion, but well made and properly fitted to his tall frame. He had trimmed his beard and combed his hair neatly, transformations that emphasized his handsome features without diminishing his frontier masculinity. His eyes warmed appreciatively as Violet descended the stairs. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm as she reached the bottom step. "Thank you," she replied, accepting his arm with a smile that reflected her appreciation of his own efforts. "You're quite handsome yourself this evening." Thompson's restaurant occupied a corner of Promise Creek's Main Street, offering the town's closest approximation to fine dining. White tablecloths and proper silverware distinguished it from the saloons and cafes that served more utilitarian meals, and the owner prided himself on serving dishes that reminded settlers of the homes they had left behind. Heads turned as Caleb escorted Violet to a table by the front window. Their entrance together represented something noteworthy in the small community. Promise Creek's most eligible bachelor openly courting the new schoolteacher. Violet felt the weight of curious gazes but found herself unbothered by them, Caleb's steady presence beside her providing a confidence she might not have felt alone. Once seated, they navigated the initial moments of adjustment, arranging napkins, reviewing the limited menu, exchanging observations about the restaurant's attempts at elegance. Beneath these ordinary actions flowed an undercurrent of awareness that this meal represented a deliberate step toward a potential future together. "I rode by the schoolhouse yesterday," Caleb mentioned after they had ordered. "Saw you in the yard with the children, teaching what looked like a geography lesson using snow sculptures." Violet laughed, recalling the creative activity she had devised to channel her students' restlessness after days of confinement indoors. "We were creating topographical maps of Wyoming Territory. Much easier to demonstrate mountains and valleys with snow than trying to explain with just drawings." "Clever approach," Caleb said admiringly. "I imagine the children appreciated the chance to play in the snow while still learning." They did indeed. Even Thomas Blackwell participated enthusiastically, and he's my most reluctant student normally. Violet smiled at the memory of the usually sullen 14-year-old boy proudly shaping a remarkably accurate representation of the Wind River Range. Their conversation flowed easily throughout the meal, moving from school matters to Caleb's recent challenges with snow-bound livestock, to books they had both enjoyed. There was none of the awkwardness Violet had often experienced during courtship dinners in Philadelphia, where conversation felt like an obligatory prelude to negotiations about potential matches rather than genuine connection. As they shared apple pie for dessert, Caleb steered the conversation toward more personal territory. "You mentioned your father is still in Philadelphia. Do you correspond regularly?" Violet hesitated, fork pausing midway to her mouth. Her relationship with her father was complicated, love tempered by his disappointment in her choice to leave, respect undermined by his financial difficulties that had stemmed partly from poor decisions. "We exchange letters monthly," she finally said. "Though I suspect he reads mine with mixed feelings. He didn't approve of my coming west." "Yet he allowed it," Caleb observed. "That suggests some respect for your judgment, even if grudgingly given." "Perhaps," Violet acknowledged. "Or perhaps he simply recognized the practical benefits of having one less dependent during difficult financial times." Seeing Caleb's questioning look, she elaborated reluctantly. "My father's business suffered several setbacks after my mother's illness. The medical expenses combined with some unfortunate investments. Well, my teacher's salary here, modest as it is, provides more independence than I could have achieved remaining at home." Caleb absorbed this information thoughtfully. "And was there pressure to solve these difficulties through an advantageous marriage?" Violet's eyebrows rose at his perceptiveness. "There was a gentleman considerably older but quite wealthy who expressed interest. My father was enthusiastic about the possibility." "But you weren't," Caleb surmised, watching her expression. "No, Mr. Harrison was not unkind, but he made it clear that continuing my teaching would be unnecessary and inappropriate for his wife." Violet set down her fork, memories of those uncomfortable conversations dimming her earlier pleasure. "He spoke of my education as a charming accomplishment, like piano playing or watercolor, painting, something to be displayed occasionally at dinner parties, but not pursued seriously." Anger flickered across Caleb's face before he controlled it. "Some men fear intelligent women," he said quietly. "It reflects poorly on them, not on you." His support warmed her, encouraging further honesty. Coming west wasn't solely about teaching or escaping unwanted suitors. "After my mother died, Philadelphia felt suffocating. Every street held memories, every social gathering included pitying glances or awkward condolences. I needed somewhere new where I could define myself by my own actions rather than by tragedy or others' expectations." Caleb reached across the table, his hand covering hers in a gesture that would have raised eyebrows in Philadelphia society but felt entirely natural in that moment. "And have you found what you were seeking here?" Violet met his gaze directly, suddenly certain of her answer. "I believe I have. Or at least, I've found the place where I can become the person I want to be." His fingers tightened briefly around hers before he withdrew his hand, conscious of their public setting. "I'm glad," he said simply. "Promise Creek is better for having you here." The remainder of their dinner passed in a glow of mutual understanding and growing attraction. When they finally left the restaurant, full moon illuminating the snow-covered street, Violet accepted Caleb's arm with a sense that something significant had shifted between them, moving from possibility to intention. They walked slowly back toward the boarding house, reluctant to end the evening despite the bitter cold. Caleb's solid presence beside her created a bubble of warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with connection. "Would you care to attend church with me tomorrow?" he asked as they neared Mrs. Peterson's porch. "I could call for you at 10 o'clock. The invitation represented another public acknowledgement of their relationship, a statement to the community that their dinner had not been a casual occurrence. Violet nodded, pleased by the prospect. "I would enjoy that very much." They paused at the foot of the boarding house steps, the moment heavy with anticipation. In the silvery moonlight, Caleb's expression was both tender and hesitant, as if weighing propriety against desire. "Violet," he began, his voice lower than usual. "These past weeks, getting to know you, they've meant more than I can properly express." She felt her heart quicken at the earnestness in his tone. "They've meant a great deal to me as well, Caleb." He moved slightly closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, see the moonlight reflecting in his eyes. "I'm not a man who rushes into things without careful consideration. But I want you to know that my intentions are serious if you're amenable to continuing our acquaintance in a formal courtship." Despite having sensed this direction in their relationship, hearing it stated so plainly sent a thrill through Violet that left her momentarily speechless. Caleb's direct approach was so different from the elaborate social dance of Eastern courtship, no subtle hints through intermediaries, no careful positioning by family connections, just honest expression of interest and intentions. "I would be very amenable," she finally replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "I value honesty above all things, and you've shown me nothing but straightforwardness from our first meeting." Relief and pleasure transformed his features. "Thank you," he said simply. Then, with careful deliberation that gave her every opportunity to step away, he leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss upon her cheek, brief, but unmistakably meaningful. When he straightened, Violet found herself breathless, the simple gesture carrying more genuine emotion than any of the practiced compliments or formal attentions she had received from suitors in Philadelphia. "Until tomorrow," Caleb said softly, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer before he stepped back, allowing her to ascend the porch steps. "Until tomorrow," she echoed, aware that she was smiling like a schoolgirl rather than a proper schoolteacher. As she prepared for bed that night, Violet's thoughts were awhirl with the evening's developments and future possibilities. Caleb Irvine was unlike any man she had previously considered as a potential partner, his education practical rather than formal, his manner direct rather than polished, his lifestyle demanding and tied to the land rather than cushioned by urban comforts. Yet these differences were precisely what attracted her. His self-reliance, his integrity, his respect for her intelligence and vocation all created a foundation for partnership that seemed more substantial than anything she had encountered in her previous life. As she drifted towards sleep, Violet recalled the first night she had spent in Wyoming Territory alone and vulnerable beside her luggage until Caleb had lifted her gently into his wagon. From that chance encounter to this evening's careful declaration of intentions seemed both an improbable journey and an inevitable progression. Whatever the future held, Violet was certain of one thing as sleep finally claimed her: the decision to come west had been the right one, leading her not only to professional fulfillment, but to the possibility of a love both practical and profound. Winter in Wyoming Territory proved harsher than anything Violet had experienced in Philadelphia. January brought temperatures so bitter that breath crystallized instantly. Ink froze in inkwells despite the schoolhouse stove's constant heat, and the short walk between school and her cabin sometimes felt like an Arctic expedition. Yet amid these physical challenges, Violet found her heart warming to both her profession and her developing relationship with Caleb. Her students had progressed remarkably in the months since school began, many showing aptitudes that had gone unrecognized by previous teachers. Even the reluctant older boys had come to respect Miss James's firm but fair approach, particularly after she introduced practical lessons in land measurement and basic engineering that related directly to their future prospects as ranchers or farmers. Caleb's courtship, meanwhile, continued with the same straightforward sincerity that had characterized their first dinner together. Sunday church attendance became a regular shared activity, followed by dinner either at the boarding house or, weather permitting, at Thompson's restaurant. He called at the schoolhouse at least twice weekly, sometimes bringing small, thoughtful gifts, a book of poetry he had ordered from Cheyenne, warm mittens knitted by his housekeeper, a clever wooden puzzle he had carved himself during long evening hours. More precious than these tokens were the conversations they shared during rides in his sleigh or quiet evenings by the schoolhouse fire. Violet learned about Caleb's childhood in Kentucky, his traumatic experiences during the war that he spoke of rarely but with profound reflection, and his dreams for expanding his horse breeding operation to include specialized training for cavalry mounts. In turn, she shared memories of her mother, her complicated relationship with her father, and her hopes of eventually establishing a proper library for Promise Creek. Their discussions ranged from practical matters of daily frontier life to philosophical questions about progress, faith, and the future of the Western Territories. By February, their courtship was an established fact in Promise Creek, commented upon with general approval by the townsfolk. Mrs. Peterson had taken to giving Violet knowing smiles whenever Caleb called, and several mothers had begun casually mentioning wedding preparations in Violet's presence, as if testing her reaction to the concept. Valentine's Day brought a special surprise when Violet arrived at school to find a beautiful arrangement of hothouse flowers on her desk, an extravagant gift that must have been ordered weeks in advance from Denver or even further east. The accompanying note, written in Caleb's precise hand, invited her to dinner at his ranch the following Saturday, the first time he had suggested she visit his home. Miss James is blushing, announced 7-year-old Lucy Wilson as the children filed into the classroom, causing ripples of giggles and teasing that Violet gently redirected to the day's lessons, though the warmth in her cheeks persisted. That Saturday dawned clear and relatively mild for February. Caleb arrived at the boarding house in his best sleigh, drawn by a matching pair of black horses whose harnesses jingled musically in the winter air. Violet had dressed with particular care in a forest green wool dress with velvet trim, her hair arranged more elaborately than her usual teaching style, a fur-lined cloak protecting her from the cold. "You look beautiful," Caleb said appreciatively as he helped her into the sleigh, tucking warm buffalo robes around her legs before taking his seat beside her. "I've been looking forward to showing you my home." The invitation represented a significant step in their relationship, and both felt the implications as the sleigh glided smoothly over packed snow toward the Irvine ranch. This was no casual visit, but an acknowledgement of serious intentions. A gentleman didn't bring a lady to his home unless marriage was a distinct possibility. After a breathtaking journey through snow-covered landscape that sparkled like diamond dust in the afternoon sunlight, they crested a small rise to reveal Caleb's ranch spread below them. Though Violet had heard descriptions from townsfolk, seeing it firsthand impressed her with the scope of what he had built from nothing over the past 8 years. A substantial log house with stone chimney anchored the property, smoke rising reassuringly from its stack. Nearby stood a large barn, corrals, and several outbuildings, all maintained with evident care despite the challenging weather. In the nearest pasture, horses moved about, their winter coats thick against the cold, steam rising from their nostrils as they grazed on hay that had been spread across the snow. "It's wonderful," Violet said sincerely as they approached. "You've created something truly impressive here, Caleb." Pride and pleasure at her approval showed plainly on his face. It's been my life's work these past years. Started with just 50 acres and a lean-to cabin. He gestured toward the substantial house ahead. Built this 2 summers ago when the breeding program finally started showing real profits. As they drew closer, Violet noticed details that spoke of both practicality and aspiration: glass windows rather than oiled paper, a covered porch that would provide shade in summer, decorative woodwork on the gable ends that went beyond mere function. Caleb had built not just a shelter but a home, designed to last and to please the eye as well as serve basic needs. They were greeted at the door by Mrs. Everett, Caleb's housekeeper, a cheerful widow in her 50s who had lost her husband to a mining accident and now lived in a small cottage on the ranch property. She welcomed Violet with genuine warmth, clearly having prepared meticulously for this important visit. The interior of the house surprised Violet with its comfort and attention to detail. Though furnished simply, each piece was well crafted, and small touches revealed Caleb's character: bookshelves filled with volumes on horse breeding, history, and literature. A chess set carved from local stone displayed on a side table, photographs of Kentucky landscapes reminding him of his origins. "This is lovely," Violet said as she removed her cloak, turning slowly to take in the main room with its massive stone fireplace and polished wood floors covered partially by colorful woven rugs. "It's been a bachelor's home until now," Caleb replied, watching her reaction carefully. "But I built it with the future in mind." The implication was clear, and Violet felt a flutter of anticipation as she recognized what he was suggesting: that he had constructed this home with the eventual hope of sharing it with a wife, perhaps even specifically with her, Mrs. Everett served a dinner that rivaled anything available in Promise Creek: venison roast, winter vegetables preserved from last year's garden, fresh baked bread, and an apple pie that filled the house with cinnamon fragrance. Throughout the meal, Violet noticed small evidences of the effort that had gone into preparing for her visit: the best china, polished silver, a tablecloth that had likely been ironed multiple times to achieve its perfect crispness. After dinner, Mrs. Everett discreetly withdrew to her cottage, leaving Caleb to show Violet the remainder of the house, a tour that included his office with its meticulous breeding records, 2 additional bedrooms prepared for future children, and a sewing room that he explained had been included specifically because his mother had always complained of lacking dedicated space for such work. Each room revealed forethought and attention to family needs, strengthening Violet's impression that Caleb had been planning for marriage long before meeting her. The realization was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. This was a man who took lifelong commitments seriously, who had prepared his circumstances carefully before seeking a partner to share them. They ended their tour in the parlor, where Caleb added wood to the fire before joining Violet on the sofa. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching flames dance behind the iron grate. "What do you think?" he finally asked, his tone casual though his eyes revealed the importance of her answer. "Of the ranch, the house, all of it." Violet considered her response carefully, knowing its significance extended beyond mere architectural appreciation. "I think you've created something remarkable, Caleb. Not just buildings and business, but a true home, one with room for growth and family and future." Relief and pleasure softened his features. "That was my intention, though until recently, the future part remained somewhat abstract." He turned slightly to face her more directly, his expression growing serious. "Violet, I invited you here today with a particular purpose in mind. These past months of knowing you have been the happiest of my life. Your intelligence, your dedication to your students, your courage in coming west alone all have shown me the quality of your character." Violet's heart began beating faster as she recognized the direction of his words. Though she had anticipated this moment might come eventually, its arrival still left her breathless with anticipation. Caleb reached for her hand, enfolding it in both of his. "I'm not a man given to flowery speeches or grand gestures. What I offer is practical but sincere, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and deep affection that has grown stronger with each day we've spent together." He paused, his blue eyes holding hers with unwavering focus. "Violet James, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of making this house truly a home, of building a life together here." Though the proposal was expected, the reality of hearing those words spoken aloud, earnest and hopeful, brought tears to Violet's eyes. This was no Philadelphia arrangement based on social connections or financial advantage, but an honest offer of partnership from a man who had proven his character through actions rather than words. "Yes, Caleb," she answered, her voice steady despite the emotion welling within her. "I would be honored to be your wife." Joy transformed his features as he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with reverence that spoke volumes about his feelings. Then, with careful deliberation that still honored propriety while acknowledging their new status, he leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss upon her lips, their first proper kiss, brief but filled with promise. When he drew back, both were smiling, the moment perfect in its simplicity and significance. No elaborate declarations were necessary between them. Their connection had been building steadily since that first night when he had found her asleep beside her luggage and lifted her gently into his wagon. "I was thinking perhaps a June wedding," Caleb suggested after a moment. "After the school term ends and before the busiest part of the ranching season begins." Violet nodded, practical considerations already entering her thoughts as well. "That seems sensible. It would allow time to make arrangements, and for my father to travel west if he's able." They spent the remainder of the evening discussing practical matters, whether Violet would finish the school year, how to announce their engagement to the community, what adjustments might make the ranch house more suited to a schoolteacher's habits. Throughout this planning, their hands remained linked, occasional glances conveying the deeper emotions beneath their pragmatic conversation. As twilight deepened outside, Caleb reluctantly acknowledged the need to return Violet to town before full darkness made travel more challenging. The ride back to Promise Creek passed in a comfortable blend of conversation and contented silence, both processing the significant step they had taken and the future it promised. At the boarding house door, Caleb kissed her once more, still properly brief, but with a warmth that suggested deeper feelings held in check by respect for public propriety. "Until tomorrow," he said softly, his eyes conveying far more than those simple words. "Until tomorrow," Violet echoed, reluctant to end the most significant evening of her life, yet knowing many more such evenings lay ahead. As she prepared for bed that night, Violet found herself contemplating the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point. From the frightened young woman abandoned at her remote way station to a confident teacher with a future as a rancher's wife, the transformation seemed both improbable and inevitable. She wrote a long letter to her father, announcing her engagement and describing Caleb's character and prospects with the hope of securing paternal approval despite the distance separating them. Whether that approval came or not, Violet was certain of her decision. Her future belonged in Wyoming Territory with the quiet, thoughtful man who had twice now rescued her, first from physical danger and then from a life without true partnership. As February gave way to March, news of Violet and Caleb's engagement spread through Promise Creek with predictable excitement. Most reactions were enthusiastically positive. The schoolteacher and the rancher seemed ideally suited in temperament and situation, each bringing complementary strengths to the partnership. The school board expressed concern about losing their teacher mid-year, but was mollified when Violet assured them she would complete the full term before marrying. Several mothers immediately began planning wedding preparations, despite the June date being months away, while shopkeepers discreetly approached Caleb about special orders from Eastern catalogs for appropriate gifts. March brought the first signs of spring to Wyoming Territory: longer days, occasional thaws that revealed patches of muddy ground, and the return of birds from southern migrations. With the improving weather came increased activity at Caleb's ranch as he prepared for the foaling season, and continued expanding his operation. Violet divided her time between teaching duties and learning about the responsibilities she would soon assume as a rancher's wife. Weekend visits to the Irvine ranch became regular occurrences, with Mrs. Everett teaching her the particular requirements of managing a household far from town conveniences. April delivered both Violet's 20th birthday and a letter from her father responding to news of her engagement. The tone was resigned rather than enthusiastic, expressing concern about her marrying a stranger in the wilderness, but acknowledging that distance made interference impractical. He confirmed he would attempt to attend the June wedding if his business affairs permitted travel. The letter disappointed, but didn't surprise Violet, who had long recognized the limits of her father's understanding regarding her choices. She shared it with Caleb during one of their Sunday afternoon rides, now a regular feature of their courtship, as trails dried enough for horses to navigate safely. "He'll change his mind when he meets you," she assured him as they paused their horses atop a ridge overlooking the greening valley. "My father judges people by their achievements, and what you've built here would impress anyone with sense." Caleb smiled at her loyalty, but seemed unconcerned by potential disapproval. "I'd welcome his blessing, but your happiness is what matters most to me," he said simply. "If he comes to the wedding, we'll do our best to show him you've made a sound choice." Such calm confidence was characteristic of their relationship, facing challenges together with practical solutions rather than dramatic declarations. This approach served them well as wedding preparations accelerated alongside spring planting and school activities. By mid-May, most details had been arranged through the combined efforts of the Ladies' Aid Society, Mrs. Peterson and Mrs. Everett. The ceremony would take place in Promise Creek's church, followed by a community celebration on the grounds if weather permitted, or in the town hall if rain threatened. Violet's wedding dress, ordered from a Denver seamstress based on careful measurements, arrived by stagecoach with just enough time for minor alterations by Miss Winters, who revealed unexpected talent with a needle. The final weeks of school passed in a blur of activity as Violet prepared her students for year-end assessments, while simultaneously organizing her personal belongings for the move to Caleb's ranch. The children presented her with a handmade quilt as a wedding gift, each student having contributed a carefully sewn square depicting something they had learned during the year. Even Thomas Blackwell sewed a square, Violet told Caleb with amazement as she showed him the quilt during his visit to the schoolhouse. "It shows the constellations we studied in February. His mother said he worked on it every evening for a week." "You've made a difference to these children," Caleb said, his pride in her accomplishments evident. "That's a gift that will outlast any material possession they could offer." Such recognition of her professional value reinforced Violet's certainty about their partnership. Caleb had never suggested she should abandon teaching after marriage, instead discussing possibilities for tutoring neighboring ranch children, or perhaps resuming a formal position once they had started their own family. June arrived with perfect summer weather, warm days, cool nights, and fields ablaze with wildflowers. Violet's father arrived by stagecoach a week before the wedding, travel-worn but determined to fulfill his paternal duties despite reservations. His first meeting with Caleb was stiffly formal, colored by Eastern prejudices about Western men and lingering disappointment that his daughter had rejected more financially advantageous matches in Philadelphia. Yet Caleb's quiet confidence and evident success gradually softened the older man's judgment. A tour of the ranch, with its well-managed operations and substantial house, provided tangible evidence of stability and good management. By the evening before the wedding, Mr. James had progressed from reluctant acceptance to cautious approval of his future son-in-law. "He's not what I would have chosen for you," he admitted to Violet as they shared a quiet moment on the boarding house porch, "but I can see why you accepted him. There's substance there and integrity. Those qualities wear better than social position or inherited wealth." Coming from her practical father, this assessment represented high praise indeed. "Thank you," Violet said sincerely, reaching for his hand. "Your approval means a great deal to me, even though I was prepared to proceed without it." Her father's eyebrows rose at this evidence of independence, but a reluctant smile followed. "You've changed, Violet, grown stronger out here. Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become." Tears pricked Violet's eyes at this unexpected connection to her mother's memory. "I hope so. I've tried to honor her values in my teaching and my choices." "You have," her father assured her, his own voice gruff with emotion. "She always said you had the strongest will of all her children." Seems she was right about that, as she was about most things. This moment of connection with her father, perhaps the most honest they had ever shared, felt like a blessing on the eve of her wedding, closing one chapter of her life with reconciliation before opening the next. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, as if Wyoming Territory itself approved the union. Promise Creek's small church filled to overflowing with townsfolk, neighboring ranchers, and Violet's students, all dressed in their Sunday best to witness the community's most anticipated event of the year. Caleb waited at the altar, uncharacteristically nervous in his new suit ordered from Denver, his ranch foreman serving as best man. When Violet appeared at the church door on her father's arm, wearing a simple but elegant white dress with lace trim, and carrying a bouquet of wildflowers gathered by her students, conversation ceased as all eyes turned to appreciate the radiant bride. The ceremony itself was brief and meaningful, traditional vows exchanged with clear voices and genuine commitment. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb's kiss was still properly restrained for public viewing, but contained a promise that brought color to Violet's cheeks and knowing smiles to the older women in the congregation. The celebration that followed on the church grounds reflected Promise Creek's frontier practicality and genuine warmth, tables laden with food contributed by every household, music provided by local fiddle players, and enough good wishes to sustain a marriage through any future challenges. Children darted between adult conversations, Violet's students proudly introducing themselves to her father as Miss James's special pupils, though they practiced calling her Mrs. Irvine with varying success. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Caleb and Violet circulated among their guests, accepting congratulations and gifts with equal gratitude. Violet noticed her father deep in conversation with Mayor Henderson, apparently finding common ground in discussions of Eastern politics and Western development. Mrs. Peterson supervised the refreshment tables with military precision, while Miss Winters played wedding marches on the portable organ brought from the church. "Happy?" Caleb asked quietly during a rare moment alone, his hand finding hers as they stood slightly apart from the festivities. Violet looked up at him, her husband now, the words still new and wondrous in her mind, and felt certainty settle around her like a comfortable shawl. "Completely," she answered truthfully. "This is where I belong, with you in this place, among these people." His smile held all the warmth and promise she could have wished for as he squeezed her hand gently. "Then let's thank our guests and head home, our home." They departed amid cheers and showered flower petals, riding in Caleb's wagon now decorated with ribbons and good luck tokens. Violet's father would remain at the boarding house for another week before returning east, giving the newlyweds time to settle into their new reality before hosting their first family visitor. The journey to the ranch felt different this time. No longer was Violet a guest being shown another's domain, but a partner returning to her rightful place. As they crested the rise that revealed the ranch buildings below, afternoon sunlight gilding the scene with golden warmth, Caleb stopped the wagon briefly. "Welcome home, Mrs. Irvine," he said, his voice holding both tenderness and pride as he offered her the reins, a symbolic gesture acknowledging her equal stake in their shared future. Violet accepted them with a smile that conveyed all the complex emotions of the moment: gratitude for the path that had led her here, joy in the present perfection, and hope for the years stretching before them. "Home," she repeated, the word holding new depth and meaning as she guided the horses forward toward the life they would build together. As the wagon rolled toward their house, Violet reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. From that vulnerable night when she sat beside her luggage until she fell asleep, until the cowboy lifted her gently into his wagon, to this day when she rode beside him not as a rescued stranger, but as his wife, the path had been unexpected yet somehow perfectly right. Wyoming Territory had tested her courage, expanded her capabilities, and ultimately given her not just the professional fulfillment she had sought but a love more genuine than anything she might have found in Philadelphia's drawing rooms. In Caleb, she had discovered a partner who valued both her strength and her vulnerability, who saw her teaching not as a temporary occupation, but as a vocation that complemented his own life's work. As they reached their home and Caleb helped her down from the wagon, his touch lingered no longer constrained by propriety, but free to express the deeper feelings that had grown between them over the months of courtship. The future stretched before them like the vast Wyoming landscape, challenging at times, certainly, but filled with possibility and beauty for those with courage enough to embrace it. And Violet James Irvine, who had once been a sheltered Philadelphia schoolteacher with nothing but hope and determination to sustain her, found herself precisely where she was meant to be home at last, in the arms of the man who had first rescued her, and then become her equal partner in creating a life neither could have imagined alone.